The brutal death of King Philip II. He was devoured alive. They called him the Prudent King. But behind the palace walls, Philip II's final days were anything but noble. The most powerful man in the world died not with a sword in his hand or a crown on his head, but soaked in blood, wrapped in bandages, swarming with flies, screaming for mercy, while his own body consumed itself. The doctors gave up, and history quietly looked the other way. Philip II, ruler of the Spanish Empire, died in a way that haunts history, not with dignity, not with silence, but in a slow, grotesque collapse. His body turned against him. His skin began to decay while he was still alive. Open sores festered across his legs and genitals. The stench was overwhelming, so strong that even seasoned attendants gagged. His room, once a chamber of power, reeked of rot. He remained conscious through most of it. Doctors changed his bandages daily, but no treatment helped. His flesh liquefied, flies nested in the wounds, sheets clung to his body like skin. He screamed through the night, not just from pain, but from the horror of it. He was being devoured alive. Witnesses say he prayed through the agony, not for death, but for forgiveness. The same man who had ordered thousands burned at the stake was now burning from the inside, skin bubbling, nerves exposed, helpless. Those closest to him whispered that it was divine judgment, God punishing the man who ruled with blood and fire. Philip didn't argue. He begged for more relics to be placed around him, clutched crucifixes and cried out to saints as if they might reach into his body and pull the rot away. But they didn't. What killed Philip wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. And it wasn't just physical. His end was a slow collapse of body, mind, and soul. A death so ghastly it was erased from royal memory. Yet for those who witnessed it, one image remained: the king of the world, lying in a bed soaked with pus and blood, inhaling the scent of his own destruction. He could smell himself dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Philip II wasn't just a king, he was an emperor in the truest sense. Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, and the vast bleeding wealth of the Americas. At the height of his power, the sun never set on his empire. Silver poured into his coffers by the ton. Armies answered his command without question, and the Catholic Church itself bent under his influence, branding his enemies heretics, granting his wars the blessing of heaven. He lived in palaces carved from marble, surrounded by gold, relics, and holy icons. No decision in Europe escaped his shadow. Every map led back to him. Every crown bowed lower when he entered a room. But the throne came with a hidden weight. Philip's days were consumed by paranoia. He ruled from behind closed doors, obsessed with letters, reports, and surveillance. He micromanaged every war, every court, every execution. He trusted no one, not even his own family. His son died under mysterious circumstances after being locked away by Philip himself. While the world feared him, he feared chaos, heresy, dissent, disorder. So he crushed them all, with prisons, with fire, with war. But in doing so, he began to hollow out the very world he'd built. He thought control would bring peace. Instead, it brought decay. Behind the walls of El Escorial, his cold, vast monastery palace, Philip turned into a man haunted by the weight of his own ambition. He prayed obsessively, surrounded by skulls and crucifixes, as if trying to outpray the consequences of his power. The empire obeyed him. The world envied him. But beneath the crown, behind the walls, and deep within his flesh, something had already begun to rot, and there was no empire strong enough to stop it. Philip II didn't just rule an empire, he controlled every inch of it, down to the ink on every page. He read every report, signed off on every order, tracked every grain shipment, every arrest, every sermon. Ministers waited weeks for his response because no decision, however small, escaped his inspection. He believed that without his direct hand, the world would fall apart. And maybe he was right, because once he started loosening his grip, it did. But control wasn't just his method, it was his obsession. He built El Escorial not just as a palace, but as a monument to order. Straight lines, cold stone, silence, every corner echoed discipline. Every room reminded visitors that here God and Philip were watching. He didn't tolerate disagreement. Ministers who questioned him disappeared. Letters that brought bad news were ignored or punished. And beyond court politics, his control turned darker. The Inquisition, which he empowered fully, became an extension of his will. People were tortured not for what they did, but for what they believed. Suspicion alone was enough. A whisper, a rumor, a missed church service. Even his own family wasn't spared. He ordered his son, Don Carlos, imprisoned, some say tortured, for erratic behavior. No trial, no explanation, just silence and a locked door. Philip wanted a perfect world, pure, obedient, holy. But what he created was a kingdom of fear. Ministers lied to survive. Subjects prayed to be ignored. And the king, locked in his own web of control, became a prisoner of it. Every day, he grew more isolated, more paranoid, more obsessed. He thought control would preserve his legacy, but all it preserved was silence. And in that silence, his body began to betray him, just like the people he never trusted. Philip II didn't inherit the Spanish Inquisition. He amplified it, transformed it, made it sharper, crueler, more relentless. Under his rule, it stopped being a religious tool. It became a machine of fear, a weapon he wielded with precision. Anyone could be a target, a scientist with the wrong ideas, a merchant with the wrong faith, a mother who failed to kneel. Heretics were hunted like animals, tortured in secret chambers, stripped of their names, burned in public squares as crowds watched and cheered or stayed silent in terror. Philip called it cleansing. He believed heresy was a disease, and like all diseases it had to be cut out, root and bone. But while he purged Spain of its so-called sins, something darker was growing inside him. His body mirrored the world he built, beautiful on the surface, rotting underneath. Sores spread across his legs and groin. Infection burrowed deep. He was decomposing while still alive. The same man who ordered thousands to the flames was now being consumed by a fire of his own. Doctors couldn't explain it. Priests whispered of divine irony. While he clung to purity, his own body turned foul. A stench clung to him, thick, bitter, impossible to ignore. It followed him through the palace like a curse. Still, he ordered more burnings, more purges, more silence. He believed if he tightened control, God would show mercy. But mercy never came. Only pain, only rot. His empire feared the Inquisition, but in the end, its master suffered the cruelest judgment of all, not from man, not from church, but from a body that refused to hide what the world refused to say. The king who made thousands burn would die rotting from the inside out. It started with a sore, small, red, easy to ignore. Philip II had survived wars, assassins, betrayals. What threat could a blemish pose to the most powerful man alive? But this wasn't just a sore. It didn't heal. It spread. The skin around it darkened, became inflamed, hot to the touch. Soon more lesions followed, painful, oozing, impossible to conceal. His inner thighs, groin, and legs became a battlefield of infection. Then came the smell. Rot. Not metaphorical, not poetic, real, sour, gag-inducing rot. His attendants noticed it first, then his courtiers, then his doctors. The stench lingered on everything, his sheets, his robes, his breath. They called it the holy disease. Some believed it was sacred suffering, God purifying his soul through pain. Others weren't so romantic. They saw it for what it was, cancerous, gangrenous, septic. His flesh was dying while he still lived. Doctors tried everything, bloodletting, poultices, searing the wounds with hot iron. Nothing worked. The disease advanced. His legs swelled, his genitals ulcerated. He could barely stand, and worse, he could barely sit without agony. Movement itself became punishment, yet Philip refused to abdicate, refused to retreat. He clung to power as his body collapsed under him. He kept ruling from his dark chamber in El Escorial, scrawling instructions through trembling hands, ignoring the rot consuming him inch by inch. He prayed louder, fasted longer, surrounded himself with relics and incense, as if holiness might drown out the decay. But the disease didn't care for prayers or politics. It spread anyway. And behind the closed doors of his palace, Europe's most powerful king became a prisoner in his own skin, drowning not in blood, but in pus, fever, and the unmistakable smell of death long before death arrived. By the final months, Philip II was no longer a king. He was a decaying body kept alive by force of will and fear. He couldn't walk. He could barely speak. His voice, once sharp and commanding, had turned into a hoarse whisper. Every word cost him pain. Every breath came with the stench of infection. His bed, once regal and ornate, became a battlefield of filth. Blood, pus, and dead skin soaked through the sheets. Fresh linens were useless. Within hours they were stained again, yellow, brown, red. Servants changed them constantly, but it made no difference. The filth returned faster than they could clean it. Flies gathered at his wounds, drawn by the heat, the wetness, the decay. They nested in his bandages, laid eggs in the folds of dying flesh. His legs were wrapped in linen soaked with ointments and prayers, but neither stopped the rot. The wrappings clung to his skin like peeling bark, pulling tissue away when removed. Beneath, the flesh was black, split, bubbling. Attendants came and went with covered mouths. Some fainted, some cried, others simply turned away, but no one could escape the smell. It clung to the walls. It filled the corridors. Visitors left with it on their clothes. And yet through all of it, Philip refused to die. He held court from that bed, issued orders, demanded reports. His empire, still vast, was run from a room that stank like a slaughterhouse. No royal portraits were painted. No scribes recorded those days in detail. But the witnesses never forgot. A king eaten by his own body, wrapped in bandages, surrounded by flies, ruling an empire while his flesh melted inch by inch. Not in silence, but in unbearable, unending pain. They were the finest physicians in Europe, men summoned from Italy, Flanders, and Spain's most learned universities. They came armed with ointments, scalpels, leeches, and holy water. But Philip II's body defied them all. They tried everything. Bloodletting left him pale and weaker. Boiled herbs were applied to the wounds, but the rot pushed through like it didn't exist. Incisions were made to drain the pus, only to find blackened flesh underneath. One surgeon attempted to cut away the infected tissue. Philip screamed until he passed out. The infection returned within days, worse than before. The king's chamber became a theatre of failure. They burned incense to mask the smell, not for the king's comfort, but for their own sanity. Some doctors began covering their faces, others asked to be reassigned. A few simply stopped showing up. Hope evaporated. No cure, no miracle, no explanation. Just a powerful man wasting away in slow, humiliating collapse. The medical men who once boasted of their cures now whispered prayers instead of prescriptions. They stood by his bed, not as healers, but as mourners, watching death crawl inch by inch across their king. Philip, who once ordered their every move, now lay helpless as they fumbled with useless treatments, too terrified to admit the truth. He was beyond saving. Not even divine favor could explain what was happening. It wasn't just a disease. It was a breakdown of flesh, faith, and science. Eventually, even the diagnoses stopped. There was no point. They cleaned his wounds, changed his bandages, and waited, not for healing, but for the moment his body finally surrendered. The most powerful king in the world was dying in plain view, and the best doctors in Europe had nothing left to offer except silence. El Escorial was supposed to be Philip II's masterpiece, a monument to God, empire, and order. Massive, silent, unforgiving. He designed it himself. Every hallway, every chapel, every chamber. A palace, a monastery, and a mausoleum all in one. He built it to last forever, but in the end, it became his cage. As his body failed, he refused to leave its stone walls. He believed El Escorial was sacred ground, protected by relics, prayers, and perfect geometry. But no structure, no matter how holy, could protect him from what was growing inside. Relics surrounded his bed, fragments of saints, splinters of the true cross, bones, cloth, holy oil, dozens of them, stacked and arranged like armor against death. But the rot didn't care. It crept through the linen, across the floor, into the stone. The air turned stale. The scent of decay overtook the incense. The halls, once echoing with monks' chants, fell quiet. Servants walked without speaking. Visitors left quickly, unsettled by the cold, by the silence, by the king's stifled groans behind the heavy doors. He had built El Escorial to show strength, order against chaos, but now chaos ruled inside. His own body unraveled while marble and gold looked on, indifferent. His fortress didn't echo with glory, it whispered failure. The man who created a palace to control death was now dying inside it, consumed by the very disorder he spent a lifetime trying to suppress. No fresco could hide the truth. No relic could cleanse the air. El Escorial stood tall, cold, eternal, but its master lay inside, weeping, praying, rotting, his greatest creation reduced to a stone shell around a dying man who believed he could outbuild death. He was wrong. The nights were the worst, when candles burned low and silence settled over El Escorial. The screams would begin. Not cries, not moans, screams, raw, guttural, desperate. They echoed through the stone corridors, bounced off vaulted ceilings, reached chambers where no one dared speak of what they heard. Servants whispered of demons, of possession, of devils come to collect the soul of a king who had sent so many to die. Some refused to go near his room after dark, others crossed themselves and kept moving, but no one could ignore it, because every scream came from the same place, Philip's bed. The pain was relentless. His body convulsed with fever, his legs throbbed with rot. Sores burst and bled through his bandages, flesh sloughed off when touched, and when it became unbearable, when the fire inside his skin was too much, he screamed, not for help, not for relief, but because it was the only thing left to do. His priests prayed, his physicians stood helpless, his guards stood still, faces turned away. No one could silence him, no one could stop the horror unfolding behind the thick doors of the king's private chamber. This wasn't a quiet death, it was violent, prolonged, louder than the bells of the chapel, more haunting than any sermon. The ruler of half the known world, reduced to a voice howling in the dark, begging for a mercy that never came. There were no assassins, no traitors, no foreign blades, just his own body, rotting from the inside, eating away at what remained, and the sound of that truth, unfiltered and inescapable, ringing through the palace he built. A king, not cursing fate, but screaming at it every night, until his voice finally gave out. Philip II didn't curse God. He begged him. As his body decayed and the pain grew unbearable, he clung tighter to faith, not for comfort, but for control. He believed his suffering had meaning, that it was a trial, a sacred test of endurance. But no one else saw holiness in what was happening. They saw a man unraveling. He demanded more relics, more saints' bones, more fragments of the true cross. His chamber became a museum of sacred remains, stacked on tables, nailed to walls, stuffed into cabinets. He kissed them feverishly, held them to his wounds, whispered to them in the dark, but still the rot spread. Masses were ordered hourly. Monks circled his room in prayer. Choirs sang outside his door. He wore blessed medallions around his neck and belts of thorns around his waist. Yet nothing changed. Every day he woke to fresh agony. Every night ended in screams. He called it purification, a final cleansing before God. But those around him weren't convinced. Even his priests went quiet. Servants exchanged glances. Some said it wasn't a test, it was punishment, a lifetime of burnings, torture, fanaticism, a man who silenced others now silenced by pain. They wondered if God wasn't testing Philip, but condemning him. Still he wouldn't let go. He doubled down, refused morphine, refused peace. He wanted to feel every moment of suffering, as if pain could buy redemption, as if devotion could rewrite what he had done. But no prayer could reverse the rot, no relic could stop the disease, and behind all his faith there was fear, not of death, but of what waited after. He believed God was listening, but the silence in that room said otherwise. Philip II ruled through fire. He lit the stakes that burned thousands, heretics, rebels, Jews, Muslims, Protestants, anyone who dared defy the church or the crown. He believed their pain was necessary. That salvation could only come through suffering. That flame purified the soul. He watched the executions without flinching, approved the torture chambers, expanded the Inquisition's power. To him, mercy was weakness. Doubt was sin, and pain was divine justice. But in the end, that same justice came for him. Not in public, not with ceremony, but in a dark room, slow and relentless. His skin blistered, his legs turned black, wounds opened and never closed. The pain was constant, sharp, deep, maddening. He was burning, not from fire but from within, infected, gangrenous, fevered, alive, and he stayed alive far longer than anyone expected. That was the true cruelty. He didn't die quickly, he lingered, days turned to weeks, every hour stretched out by pain, no comfort, no relief, just a steady descent into rot and humiliation. He begged, not to men, but to God, for mercy, for forgiveness, for a reason. But no answer came. The same priests who had blessed the burning stood by his bed in silence, powerless. The same church that upheld his authority could only watch as its champion was reduced to a husk. He had given his life to defend the faith. Now the faith gave nothing in return, and so the king who sent others to burn died smothered in his own filth, crying out to the heavens for a mercy he had never offered. There was no firewood beneath him, no crowd to witness it. But make no mistake, Philip II burned, and the flames came from within. When Philip II finally died, it wasn't with dignity, it was with a whimper. Surrounded by the stink of infection, soaked in blood and pus, barely recognizable. But you wouldn't know it from the official records. The court scribes wrote carefully, "His Majesty endured his final illness with great fortitude and Christian piety." They spoke of grace, faith, and divine peace. They didn't mention the flies, the screams, the rot. His death was sanitized, scrubbed clean in ink, polished for posterity. A monarch of his stature couldn't be remembered as a decaying corpse begging for release. So they wrote a different version, one that suited the church, one that preserved the myth. But truth has a way of leaking out. Servants talked, attendants wrote letters, confessors left notes never meant to be read aloud, hidden in private diaries and dusty archives of fragments, enough to piece together the real story. Eyewitnesses who described the unbearable stench, the horror of seeing his skin fall away, the way priests avoided his room, not out of reverence but revulsion. They wrote of a man drowning in holy relics and still rotting, of a king who muttered prayers between screams, of a room so thick with the smell of death that candles struggled to burn. The crown couldn't allow that truth to survive. History had to remember Philip as the Prudent King, not the screaming wreck that haunted El Escorial. So they buried the body, sealed the chamber, and erased what they could. But memory lingers, whispers survive, and behind the marble tomb and polished legacy lies a truth too grotesque to carve into stone. The king died like no king should. And the silence that followed wasn't respect. It was shame. Philip II's suffering didn't end with death. His body, broken and rotted by months of infection, refused to stay still even in the grave. The moment he died, embalmers were rushed in. It was tradition. The body of a king had to be preserved, prepared for display, honored, but when they opened his linens, what they found was beyond repair. His flesh was soft, wet, unstable. Blisters had ruptured, skin peeled like damp parchment, pockets of gas swelled beneath the surface. The smell, already unbearable in life, became overwhelming in death. Even the most seasoned of royal morticians were shaken. Gloves didn't help. Perfume couldn't mask it. They tried anyway. Holy oils, myrrh, ice, bandages soaked in herbs. But the rot was faster. Within hours, fluids began to seep through the wrappings. The wounds kept weeping. The embalming process broke down as quickly as his body had. No final viewing was held. No grand procession. The body was hidden, placed in a coffin lined with lead, and taken down to the crypt beneath El Escorial in silence. Even then, the leaking continued. They sealed the tomb faster than planned. Some say the stone was stained before the lid was lowered. It was supposed to be a royal burial, dignified, sacred, clean. It became a desperate attempt to contain what was left. The monks said prayers. The court wept on command. But behind the rituals there was only one truth. His body had become something unnatural. Something that refused to follow the rules of death, just as it had broken the limits of life. Philip wasn't just a corpse. He was a warning. And even in death he leaked, not just blood, not just rot, but the unbearable memory of how power ends, ugly, bloated, and hidden underground. Philip II died, but something stayed behind. His empire did not collapse overnight, but it bled, quietly, relentlessly, just like he did. His son, Philip III, inherited the throne but not the strength. A weaker man, easily manipulated, obsessed with ceremony, blind to decay. Under his rule, corruption spread like the disease that had killed his father. Then came more kings, more bloodlines, each one more fragile than the last. Madness crept into the royal family, degeneration of the body and worse, of the mind. Infertility, deformity, paranoia. A string of rulers who seemed more like shadows than monarchs. Spain's enemies grew bolder, its colonies rebelled, its power shrank. The once great empire that stretched across continents began to fracture. One war led to another, one defeat followed the next. Gold dried up, influence faded, glory became memory. People began to whisper, not about politics, not about strategy, about the curse, about the rot that started with Philip, the king who burned heretics and died rotting, the king who turned prayer into policy, torture into virtue, the king who tried to control everything and lost everything in the end. Was it divine punishment? Was it inherited guilt? Or was it something worse, something embedded into the very walls of El Escorial, passed down like blood? Whatever it was, it lingered. You can see it in the faces of the portraits that followed him. Tired, pale, withdrawn. You can read it in the endless accounts of betrayal, sickness, and decline, a dynasty that choked on its own legacy. Philip tried to build eternity. Instead, he left a stain that nothing could wash out. His body was buried, but the rot never stopped spreading. Philip II is remembered as El Prudente, the Prudent King, the architect of empire, the defender of Catholicism, the man who ruled the world from a desk, who buried rebellions with letters and crushed nations in silence. But they don't teach how he died. They don't mention the screams that rattled El Escorial each night, the sores that split his skin open, the fluids that soaked through his sheets, the flies that circled his face like vultures. They don't talk about the fever that warped his mind, or the stench that drove servants to vomit outside his door. They call him wise, yet he died as a spectacle of agony. They call him holy, yet no relic could stop the rot. They call him powerful, but in the end he had no control. Not over his body, not over his soul, not over the legacy he left behind. Because that kind of death doesn't fit in textbooks. It can't be carved in marble or painted in oils. It can't be sung in hymns or read in royal decrees. It doesn't match the image of a king who ruled with order and faith. It's not convenient. It's not glorious. So it's erased. Whispers take the place of truth. Archives bury the details. Official histories paint him as calm, devout, triumphant to the last breath. But the real Philip died choking on decay, surrounded by relics that did nothing and priests who looked away. His was a death that should have humbled power, but instead it was buried, sealed beneath stone and silence, because some deaths make men into legends, and others, like Philip's, reveal too much, so they are forgotten, on purpose.